Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I wanted to check back in with a gentleman I've had the pleasure of meeting before. He's in Kyiv, Ukraine. He's the Ukrainian alert editor at an organization called the Atlantic Council. Peter Dickinson is his name. Peter, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, nice to join you again.
Nice to see you, sir. So you've been in Kyiv for quite a while now, and you are publishing quite frequently at the Atlantic Council. Tell us, if you could, just a little bit about yourself, the Atlantic Council, and why the heck you're in Kyiv in the middle of a war.
Well, I'm a long-term resident of Ukraine. I came here. I'm British originally, but I moved to Ukraine after university. So that was over 20 years ago now, at the end of the 1990s. I graduated and came to Ukraine initially for 1 year with the British Council, which is effectively the cultural wing of our Foreign Office. And I stayed. I fell in love with the country, and I became fascinated by Ukraine. And I've remained so ever since. So that's really my story in a nutshell. I've moved from the diplomatic service into media. I've run various different media projects, and for the last 4 years, I've been running the Atlantic Council's Ukraine service. The Atlantic Council is a Washington, D.C. based think tank. It was set up in the 1960s during the Kennedy administration. As a think tank, that sort of intellectual aspect to the North Atlantic relationship, to the ties between Europe, then Western Europe, and North America, and has since become even broader to encompass all of Europe. It's a global organization, so there's interests all over the world, but there is a strong accent at this point on Ukraine because of events here, because of the war itself.
Now, you publish quite prolifically, both yourself and the Atlantic Council. Let's come back to some of those issues in a minute. Just tell me about your life personally, if you could. Looks like you've got electricity, and it's a sunny day, it would appear. What's life like in Kyiv in the middle of a war?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, touch wood, as they say, it's fine. There's not the fighting itself. I suppose the first thing I should say is that the fighting, which continues and is extremely fierce, is a long way from here. Ukraine is a huge country. It's always important to underline that. Not compared to America or Canada, but on European standards, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. It's a very, very large country. And the fighting itself, which is going on as we speak, is approximately 500 kilometers from where I sit. So it's a long way away. It's not like we're in the middle of an active war zone. It's the distance between I don't know, maybe London and Paris, perhaps. So we don't feel there's no immediate physical danger. We have until recently. There's been a very concerted Russian airstrike campaign across the whole country that began in October, and you referenced that with the comment about electricity. The Russian campaign was that it was a deliberate attempt to destroy Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, primarily the electricity, water services, and so forth. The basic amenities. That was a challenge for many people. I actually I live outside of Kiev in a suburb, so we have our own water supply. We have a generator for electricity, so we were not so inconvenienced as many. Those living in the big cities were very inconvenienced, of course. They couldn't necessarily install generators in their homes, living in apartment blocks. People often found themselves if you were living on a higher floor, for example, you would have an issue of using the lift because the electricity might cut out halfway down. People often got stuck in lifts. So some people, especially those with small children, those with mobility issues, often found that they actually couldn't leave their apartments in practice very much during this whole extended period from October until quite recently. However, since February, that's died off now. Ukraine has been very, very good at repairing the damage caused by these airstrikes and has beefed up its air defenses considerably. And it seems, although we don't know, but the evidence is, the proof is in the pudding, as it were. It seems that Russia has run low, is running out of rockets. Essentially, has run low on its missile supplies.
So have the airstrikes on Kyiv abated?
Well, it's less, yeah. I mean, we again, touch wood, I don't want to tempt fate. It could happen again, and they do happen sporadically. But the airstrikes we're seeing now are on a much smaller scale. We were seeing, to give you an idea, we were seeing at a peak, you might have 70 or 80 rockets attacking Kiev, cruise missiles attacking targets in Kiev and across Ukraine. Recently, there's been a much bigger emphasis on very cheap or comparatively cheap drone strikes. And the rocket attacks have been much lower numbers, maybe dozens, maybe 20, 30. So the implication is that Ukraine's better at defending, it's better at repairing, and Russia is running out of these rockets. So together we're seeing that essentially now, a lot of people are now saying they're confident enough to say basically that campaign has failed.
So the attitude, the sense was that was intended to either terrorize the Ukraine population or at least weaken them dramatically because of the lack of electricity, the lack of heat, the cold winter, etc. And your sense is that's failed?
Yes. The sense now is it's failed. And the other fact, of course, is now it's spring. As you mentioned, it's nice. It's a nice sunny day here. It's plus 15 degrees. The sun's out. It's and it will continue in that way. The Ukrainian winter is a serious thing. It's a severe winter. The temperatures drop down very low or below freezing for weeks on end. There's often heavy snow. And so being without electricity and heating in that situation it can be a life or death issue. It's a very serious issue. So the perception was that Russia was trying to basically freeze Ukrainians into surrender, to freeze them back to accept Russia's terms. It was a campaign that was very consciously and openly targeting the civilian population, which is of course a war crime, but that is not an issue that concerns the Russians. They were very open about the fact that they were targeting the civilian population. They spoke about it frequently on the state, the Kremlin-controlled media in Russia, very enthusiastically, even I would say, gloating about these attacks and gloating about images of Ukraine in darkness. Most people, if I think I can show me, I can say here, I've got just behind me here, you can see, this is all the kit. I still have the torches. I've got many more of these around the house, little power packs like this. We were buying things because we were often finding ourselves, we'd be sitting there and then boom, the lights would go out. Again, I say we're lucky we have a generator. It's not so serious for us, but even here in our house, it was an issue, and you had to be prepared for these things. So the Russians were targeting the civilians basically, but they seem to have failed.
What about getting groceries and going to the doctor and like regular daily going to school? What about regular stuff like that? Are you able to live?
Yes. Even at the height of these airstrikes and the power cuts and the blackouts, normal life did continue. There was an enormous amount of generators shipped into Ukraine and installed throughout the town. So if you were walking in Kiev, for example, during this period, you would have had most of the time, or certainly a lot of the time, there would be a constant buzz in the background, this noise of thousands of generators working. People installed them all over the streets. They put them on balconies. Big shopping centers had huge generators, industrial-sized generators brought in and installed. So the Ukrainians are incredibly resilient people and extremely resourceful. This is a national character trait of Ukrainians, which I think has always been there, but especially was honed in the 1990s, when after the Soviet collapse, there was a real breakdown in the functioning of the state. People were living in desperate poverty, and a lot of very basic things did not work anymore. And people adapted, and they became very, 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 very adaptable. adept at adapting, very skilled. So that comes to the fore at times like this, and that was something we saw a lot of over the past 6 months. So yes, normal life goes on. And you mentioned school. I have 2 children. They're at school every day. They are, and they're fine, and their classmates are there. They do have air raids. So on many days, not every day, but certainly probably approximately every other day, at some point during the day, the air raid siren will go off, and they have to go down into the school basement area, which has been converted into sort of makeshift classrooms, and they continue their lessons there. But that is the extent of the disruption. Of course, that's not great, but they manage. They adapt.
We're chatting tonight with Peter Dickinson. He is the Ukraine Alert Editor at the Atlantic Council. We've talked about his life in Kyiv. We're going to now turn, after a quick break, and talk about some of the issues that he and the Atlantic Council have written about in regards to the war. One of the articles I'd like to ask you about right away, if I could, when we're back, is, I think you pronounce it Bucha, but you published an article about a year after liberation that Ukraine's Bucha stands as a terrible, terrible example of atrocities. And I'd like to know a little bit more about that. I'd like to chat about some of the other articles that you've written, the Atlantic Council has issued and published in regards to the progress of the war, some of the issues that are going on, and really get a detailed sense, if we could, of the status of the war in Ukraine right now. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is the status of the Russian invasion, the Russian war in Ukraine. Our guest is Peter Dickinson. He is the Ukraine Alert Editor at an organization called the Atlantic Council. And we've just chatted a little bit about his life in Kyiv. He's been there for a couple of decades, and he's been involved in the Atlantic Council for a while. Both in media, currently as well, previously in the diplomatic corps. You published, or I don't know whether you wrote it or whether the Atlantic Council wrote it, but you published an interesting, quite a scary, frankly, from my disgusting might be a better word, article about a year in and the example of Bucha and the atrocities. And a year in, it stood as an example of the atrocities. Have you been to Bucha? Is it real? Like, it just seems unbelievable that people in today's world could do that. Tell me a little bit about Bucha.
Yeah, it is unbelievable. It is terrifying to think I think one of the many reasons. I mean, the first, obviously, the impact of Bucha is the pronunciation. Bucha is a suburb of Kiev. It's a quiet, leafy, very typical European suburban community. So there are a lot of apartment blocks, a lot of houses, homes, little garden plots, little parks, little shopping centres, cafes. Very, very sleepy place. A very, very unremarkable and pleasant. So the idea of this nightmare, this Russian occupation, descending on this leafy, quiet suburban idol is sort of the contrast adds to the horror of it. Russian troops occupied Bucha in the early days of the war and were there for around 1 month, and then in the end of March, early April, they withdrew as Russia effectively lost the Battle of Kiev and was facing was in danger of becoming, the Russian troops who were based around Kiev, essentially to the north of the city, were in danger of becoming encircled and cut off. So they basically withdrew. They pulled out. Their attack on Kiev had failed, and so they all withdrew. Once they'd withdrawn and the Russian troops advanced, the Ukrainian troops advanced, and they entered Bucha, they were confronted by scenes of unspeakable horror, terror. Hundreds of people were murdered. Bodies were strewn all over the streets. There were various instances of mass graves uncovered, accounts of people being summary executions, groups of people being killed in basements, mass sexual violence against women, groups of women, children, and the list goes on and on.
Let me interrupt, Peter, if I could. You said mass violence against women. Do you think this was mass? Was this something that was happening everywhere, or was this an isolated incident of a few soldiers that went crazy? Like, what's your sense? What's the world's sense, Ukraine's sense? Is this something that was ordered to occur, or is it just some crazy, stupid people that went a little off the rails?
Well, this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of the whole issue of the atrocities that are taking place. That Bucha has become a symbol because it was the first place, because it was so close to Kiev, and because it was the first place where the international media was able to access as well. But in fact, everywhere that's been liberated has uncovered similar incidents, similar accounts, evidence of similar killings in the south, in Kherson, in the east, in Kharkiv. Again, we're talking about vast areas, very diverse areas, and very and absolutely totally different Russian occupation troops. But the behaviors that we're seeing, the use of sexual violence as a weapon of terror, essentially, the killing of anybody or the abduction of people who were deemed to be potentially a threat, or people who they simply found to be they just simply choose to kill. In many cases, it seems to be random. The mass abduction and deportation of people, all these crimes are happening pretty much everywhere where Russian troops are based, where they manage to establish an occupation administration. And the numbers are significant. I mean, we're not talking about millions of deaths, but we are talking about thousands of deaths. And we're talking about millions of people being deported to Russia. Now, recently, we're hearing a lot about the deportation, the abduction of children to Russia, which actually very, very welcome news last month. That Putin himself was charged with war crimes by the International Criminal Court for his role in the abduction of children, the mass abduction of Ukrainian children. But the deportation issue is much bigger than just children. We're talking about millions of people here who've been forced to travel to Russia, who are now being located throughout Russia, often in the very far distance, in the very furthest regions of Russia in the Far East. So it's part of it. It's seen certainly in Ukraine, and I think a lot of people internationally now are coming to recognize that these are the mass killings, the deportations, the abductions, the sexual violence, and then we also have the suppression of Ukrainian identity wherever the Russians are, the suppression of the Ukrainian language, national symbols, removal of all signs of Ukraine, essentially. This is all part of a very, very coordinated campaign to eradicate Ukraine, to basically extinguish the Ukrainian state and to force people to become Russians. They're also being made to accept Russian passports. People are being essentially told in occupied regions, if you do not take a Russian passport, you won't have access to anything. You won't have access to basic amenities. You won't be able to. You'll be cut off even in your house from gas and heating supplies. You won't be able to apply for a pension or any state support or visit a doctor or have access to any sort of state engagement with the authorities. So you have a terror campaign, physical terror campaign, suppression of Ukrainian identity, and forced Russification going on in all these areas, all of them. And this is not the actions of rogue commanders or troops who've got run amok. This is the plan. This is what Russia intends to do in Ukraine, and this is what they are doing in areas under occupation. And this is what we have to assume they would do if they took control of the whole country.
Is this genocide?
Yes, without question, in my mind. I've been clear since the very first weeks of the invasion that this was a genocidal plan, that the plan they had. And ever since then, all that we've seen merely confirms, underlines that that is their goal. And frankly speaking, they're not really very subtle about it. They're not discreet. They've not attempted to cover their tracks. They very openly talk about claiming Russian land. They very openly say there is no Ukraine. Putin has written entire essays saying that Ukraine is not a country, that Ukraine is not a legitimate state, that the lands of Ukraine are inherently part of Russia, that Ukraine must be part of Russia, that Ukraine has no right to exist. And Russian state media, which sets the agenda in Russia, and is by far the most important source of information for the Russian public, it has absolutely normalized genocidal language about Ukraine. Just today, just to give you one of we could talk all day about examples. I mean, but just the day we're speaking now, former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, so a very senior authority, has made a post on social media saying Ukraine will not exist. There is no, there will be no Ukraine. No one needs Ukraine, and Ukraine will cease to exist, which is pretty much as genocidal as you can get. And that was a public post that he made. He wasn't without any prompting. Just that gives you an idea of the level of the genocidal intent that's on display in today's Russia. And the intent in Russia is being matched by the actions on the ground in Ukraine.
The Atlantic Council just a day ago published an article about the Wagner Group and said that that it and other Russian mercenary organizations may ultimately be liabilities, not assets for Putin. Tell me what that's all about in regards to the Wagner Group. Why would it be a liability if today it's leading the advances in the East?
Well, the Wagner Group has been the only real success story, I think, of Russia's invasion, militarily speaking. They have made some gains in the East. I wouldn't want to overstate that, because I think the gains they've made are quite modest. I mean, we're talking about the seizure of towns rather than cities, for example, and the advances that they've made have often come at huge cost. Which is one of the reasons why the Wagner Group initiated the policy of recruiting prisoners last summer. So essentially, they were bringing in cannon fodder, which was then used as a sort of battering ram to lead their advances in East Ukraine, and especially around the town of Bakhmut, which is the focus of Wagner's efforts. But they've become the poster boys of the campaign, because I think Russia's military performance in general has been so disappointing and so out of step with the image that the Russian military has within Russian society. Most Russians have very modest standards of living. The general standard of living is low. They lack freedoms, and they know that. They're not completely cut off from reality. They're aware of the shortcomings of Russian life. But one of the things that has always been a constant in Russia is this sense of pride that, well, at least we have a powerful army. At least we have a strong army. And that is a source of great pride to many Russian people. And it's taken as a sort of article of faith that Russia, yes, it has issues. Yes, it's an authoritarian regime. Yes, they don't have a lot of the niceties and freedoms that people in the West may enjoy, but they have a mighty army, and this is a great source of pride. Actually, what we've seen over the last year is that they don't have a mighty army, that their army is corrupt, that it's actually a paper tiger, so to speak, that a lot of the things they believed in were simply not true, and the army has performed very poorly. So Wagner and its comparative success has sort of catapulted this group to the forefront as poster boys, and they've become very celebrated in the Russian media, and they've become sort of champions of people say, well, this is the real Russia. Look at the army. Yeah, there's corruption in the army. Okay, that's bad, but look at these guys. These are real Russians. So they've become very influential, and there's been a lot of concern amongst the establishment in Russia over the last few months that they're getting too popular. They're becoming too big. The leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's a former convict turned sort of entrepreneur, restaurateur, businessman, sort of friend of Putin, essentially, who's an extremely wealthy figure, has become a very prominent public figure over the last year, and especially over the last half year. And he's taken the very unusual step in Russia of criticizing establishment figures, members of the top hierarchy of the military, members of the Ministry of Defense, by name, to be, and quite insultingly as well, not in a sort of academic or restrained manner, to be quite offensive about figures within the hierarchy of the Putin regime. Now, that has always been a big taboo. Now, you don't do that in Russia. You don't go after the establishment, however bad they may be. And that's something that's understood. So he's broken that taboo, and he's done so because he feels emboldened by this status he enjoys as, you know, the only guy who's actually doing it in Ukraine, the only guy who's actually bringing success. So he's been out there making these outspoken comments. Now, more recently, we've seen efforts, apparently, it would appear, to muzzle him, to sort of bring him down a few notches, to cut away his access to weapons and artillery and equipment, to prevent him from recruiting more prisoners from prisons, to sort of clip his wings and to sort of bring Wagner down to size. There's also been reports that the Russian media have been instructed not to talk about Wagner anymore, not to play down their role in the war. So the feeling is, and the article you reference, is that these guys could become an issue for Putin because they're getting a little too big for their boots. They're getting a little bit outside of their controlled frame. And if the military situation in Ukraine for Russia continues to deteriorate, then people maybe will look to these groups and say, come on, do something, i.e. do something against these people in the Russian military who are making a hash of it, who are corrupt, who are bad leaders, who are bad commanders. And then you have potential for conflicts within Russia with these groups playing a prominent role. And that's the expectation, I think, that these groups could start to play a role within Russia in terms of internal fighting, domestic unrest, instability.
It's got to be a risk if you've got an alternative military. There's just no question about that, particularly if it's if it thinks it's doing a better job than the regular government, the regular military. I understand that you were on TV recently talking about Putin's indication that he was going to move nuclear weapons into Belarus. And you said that this was an indication that the war was not going well. Explain that, if you could.
Well, the Russian use of nuclear blackmail has been a feature throughout the war. We saw it in the very first days. Putin immediately, as soon as he began his invasion, I think within day two, I think it was, he also announced that he was putting his nuclear forces on high alert, which was seen as a signal at the time to the West: do not interfere, do not get involved. And then later on, when things were starting to go badly in East Ukraine, and they lost a large part of the territory they controlled in East Ukraine in September, again, Putin began saber rattling with nuclear weapons. So he tends to do this, and he's done it before this war as well, at times when his position is threatened, when he feels weak, when he is under pressure. And he's done it specifically in the Ukraine war. You see, he's done it at times when he has felt vulnerable or when he's been looking to send a message to the West. Now, of course, we don't know for sure, and we can't say 100% for sure that it's all a big bluff. That's the advantage of this nuclear blackmail for Russia. They know that the West cannot totally discard it. But there is a sense that the more times he does this, the less seriously it is taken. And particularly at this point now. After his, as I mentioned in September, he made a number of statements relating to nuclear weapons that were very obviously threatening in manner. They were very veiled threats. He didn't immediately say, "I will use nuclear," but he more or less very clearly made that implied threat. So after that happened, there was a lot of pushback internationally. The Americans publicly and privately warned Russia that if they crossed the nuclear threshold, there would be, to quote the White House, catastrophic consequences. Now, I believe those consequences would include direct NATO intervention in the war in Ukraine. NATO forces would wipe out the Russian forces in Ukraine. They would sink the Black Sea Fleet, which is based in Crimea, Russian-occupied Crimea, and perhaps also take out various strategic targets in Russia itself. They would not respond necessarily with nuclear weapons. I don't think that's anticipated, but they would respond in overwhelming form. And crucially, the other major players in this dialogue, China and India, who are not supportive of the West, although they maintain a certain distance from Russia. They also have said to Putin, again, publicly and privately, we do not support this nuclear talk. We think it's reckless. We think it must stop. We are against this. And they've been quite vocal by their standards in that. So Putin was he received quite a harsh rebuke for these comments in autumn. And he left the subject for a while, but now, just recently, we had Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, visiting Moscow, and Russia was very hopeful that this would mark a transformation or a turning point or a landmark in the cooperation between China and Russia, when China would actually increase its support for Russia, would provide Russia with more military support and more economic support, and would align itself more clearly with Russia. Now, that didn't happen. There was a lot of very nice platitudes and a lot of talk in Moscow that China and Russia are allies and they share the same interests, and China understands Russia and China doesn't condemn Russia. But fundamentally, China did not even agree to a second pipeline with Russia for the gas, which is Russia desperately needs. They did not agree to provide Russia with any weapons or military support. And they actually, again, stressed, Xi Jinping, whilst in Moscow, stressed that they did not approve of nuclear blackmail and nuclear threats. And they specifically, he said, actually, they signed a joint declaration that nuclear weapons must not be deployed outside the boundaries of nuclear powers. So just days after that, we have Mr. Putin saying publicly, well, you know what, we're going to move some nuclear weapons into neighboring Belarus. So this was quite a clear indication, in my opinion, that Russia was very frustrated by China's stance, that they hadn't got what they wanted, and they were sending a message primarily to China, not to the West, China, saying we're not happy with the way this partnership that you talk up but don't act on is going. We'd like to see more, and we're going to act unilaterally now and put our nukes in Belarus. So it was in many ways a reaction to China's visit that was disappointing and anticlimactic for Russia, but also, again, it sends a message to the West: don't get ahead of yourselves. We're still dangerous. You can't predict us, and we may still take dramatic, dangerous actions. Again, the Russian position over the last few months has significantly weakened. The West has provided. The West has been providing Ukraine with weapons since before the invasion, going back to January of 2022. But for the first 6 months of the war, the weapons they provided were pretty basic in terms of the nature of the weapons, in terms of the quantities. Essentially, they were weapons for an insurgency. We're talking about, over-the-shoulder sort of, rocket launchers, sort of mujahideen type things, guns, bullets, and then it became artillery shells and artillery. And then it became rocket systems. And now, since the new year, it's become very sophisticated anti-aircraft technologies, Patriot systems. It's become Western tanks, large numbers of armored vehicles. Very recently, it's become fighter jets. So the Western support for Ukraine is not decreasing as Russia anticipated. It's increasing. At the same time, Russia is running out of its own weapons, we believe. Again, I mentioned missiles earlier. There are reports of Russia bringing tanks out of storage that date back to the 1950s, 1960s, pretty old stuff. I mean, they're still dangerous. They can still fire a shell. They can still cause damage, but you wouldn't want to put one of these tanks on a battlefield against a modern American or British tank for sure. It wouldn't last long. And the Russians have launched an offensive in the last few months in the east that has been so bad that some people even question whether it even happened or not. We're talking about an offensive along a front line of hundreds of miles, and they've made gains. I think the last information I saw from March is that they claimed approximately 70 square kilometers, which is essentially, a couple of small villages, and they'd lost for that effort, they lost tens of thousands of troops. Some people would say 50, 60,000, some would lowball maybe 20, 30,000, but huge numbers of troops, huge numbers of tanks and vehicles that they can't replace easily for an offensive which essentially went nowhere, World War I style. So that's the background to Putin saying, I'm going to start threatening you with my nuclear weapons again. I'm going to start threatening to deploy them to Belarus. Now, strategically, it doesn't change anything. What difference does it make if the nukes are in Belarus or in Russia? There's a difference of like 200-300 kilometers. There's no military sense in doing that. It doesn't change the military equation at all. It's just a pretty desperate measure to sort of say, I'm still dangerous. You have to take me seriously.
We're chatting tonight with Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council about the war in Ukraine. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back, and I'm going to ask him a little bit about this spring offensive that we keep hearing about, a little bit about Finland and its entree into to NATO. We're going to be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. I'm really interested in hearing what Peter Dickinson, the Ukraine alert editor at the Atlantic Council, who is in a suburb of Kyiv right now, Kyiv, Ukraine, has to say about the war in Ukraine and what's going on. He's a prolific writer. He has been in Ukraine. He's a British citizen, but he's been in Ukraine for a couple of decades, both originally as a diplomat or in the diplomatic corps, and now as a media person. I want to come to the spring offensive that we keep hearing about in a minute. But before that, you've written two things, or been on TV at least, and then written about Finland entering NATO. And I guess you first said that the silence from Russia was deafening, and that it doesn't mean that NATO is a threat to Russia. Tell me about why you thought the silence from Russia was deafening.
Well, we've been hearing for a long, long time from Russia that NATO expansion is the source of tension between Russia and the West. This has been a narrative that Putin himself and Russia in general, but especially Putin, has pushed almost since his first days of certainly since his second term. For the last, say, 15 years, it's been a constant theme that NATO is a threat to Russia, that NATO expansion is a source of tension with Russia, and that NATO expansion is an anti-Russian policy. And then in the last year or so, certainly in the months leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, NATO expansion was placed front and center. It was the main reason that Russia gave for the invasion. Essentially, it was the grievance that Russia positioned, saying, "Well, why are we building troops up on the border with Ukraine? Why are we threatening Ukraine? Why are we so dissatisfied? Why are we calling for an entire revision of international relations?" Well, it's simple. It's NATO expansion. This is a dangerous threat to Russia. So that's the narrative that we've been hearing for a long time. That's a very well-established Russian narrative. NATO as a threat. Now, last year, Finland announced, in response to the invasion of Ukraine, announced that it would be abandoning decades of neutrality to join NATO. This was announced in May. Now, Finland has a shared border with Russia of 1,340 kilometers, around 800 miles. So it's the second longest border with Russia on the European side of Russia after Ukraine. It's a very long border, and it's just next to St. Petersburg, Russia's second biggest city. So if Russia really genuinely saw NATO as a threat, as it's always said, if NATO expansion was such a security threat to Russia, if it was such a serious challenge to Russia's domestic security, you would have expected them to react to this. They're going to have NATO on their border in Finland. It's a big shift in the strategic balance of the region, and you would expect them to make a huge protest about this, to mobilize their diplomatic forces, their political force, the economic, certainly military. In response to this, actually, they did nothing. They did literally nothing. And even more than that, they, over the course of the summer, after Finland had already announced it was going to join NATO, they withdrew their troops from the Finnish border. We believe, according to different intelligence reports, approximately 80% of the Russian troops in the border area who've been based there for decades were withdrawn. So Russia demilitarized a border with NATO, with a future NATO member, which was on the cusp of joining NATO. So these actions, this reaction of Russia, and at the same time, the Kremlin made very modest comments saying they didn't like it, of course, but they didn't object. Putin downplayed it. Putin said it's not a big issue. It's not a challenge for us. And so there's a huge disconnect between this rhetoric that we have to invade Ukraine and cause this huge war because Ukraine has NATO aspirations, although Ukraine, by any standards, was decades away from NATO membership. Frankly speaking, it was very unlikely that Ukraine would ever have achieved NATO membership. Nobody who I've ever, no serious commentator would suggest that Ukraine was close to NATO membership. I mean, at best, it was probably decades away. But we're told by Russia that's a cause for a major war. And yet the other big neighbor, which is literally about to join NATO, and everybody says, yes, they'll join in a matter of months, and Russia does nothing. Russia makes no action. So it's quite clear, I think, from this contradictory responses, this inconsistency, that the issue was never actually NATO. The issue was always Ukraine and Russia's desire to control Ukraine. I mean, we could get into the issue of NATO in more detail, and frankly, the idea that NATO would ever attack Russia is pretty absurd. But even if we just, if we don't really need to go into that. It's just quite clear. These two neighbours, one of which is about to join NATO, one of which has got a very, very slim chance of perhaps sometime in the future NATO, and Russia's okay, we're going to attack that one. This one we don't worry about. It makes no sense. So I think this is a real moment where the Russian argument about NATO basically falls down.
You spoke a couple minutes ago about a different level of armaments that the West is providing to Ukraine today than it was 6, 9, 12 months ago. We keep hearing about the potentiality of a spring offensive. Do you think there will be one? And if so, where and what will you be looking for?
Well, I think there certainly will be. Yeah, I don't think that's in any doubt. Ukraine's been marshalling its forces, its resources for months in preparation of this spring offensive. They've been training soldiers abroad for months in large numbers. They've trained tens of thousands of soldiers in the UK, in Poland, in Germany, in a number of Europe, in a number of partner countries. Those troops are now mostly back in Ukraine. They've been trained in joint forces offensive operations. So that core is now more or less ready. Now they're consolidating it and getting all the kit together, all the weapons, all the new weapons they're getting. So the tanks that were agreed upon in January are now arriving in Ukraine. That's primarily Challenger tanks from the UK, Leopard tanks from Germany and other European countries. They will be integrated into the Ukrainian military. They are being now. Training has already taken place on those tanks. There's also a large number of tanks. It's dozens, I think, perhaps hundreds, low hundreds in total in terms of the new tanks. There's a significantly large number of armored vehicles have been provided. Again, primarily by Germany, Britain, France, and the UK. Sorry, and Germany. So Ukraine has been building up essentially an army, a sort of army in reserve to throw into the mix, and we expect this to happen in the next probably month or so. I think it's the most likely date, I would say, will be late April, early May. A lot of it depends on weather conditions, on the ground. When the attack happens, the goal will be to break through the Russian lines and to make presumably the most likely scenario would be to try and cut Russian forces in two. At the moment, Russia has a line, a more or less unbroken line of occupation from the east down to the south of Ukraine, down to Crimea, a sort of crescent of occupation on eastern and southern Ukraine. They will try to break through that crescent and isolate the troops who are towards Crimea in the south. That would be the most obvious line of attack, I would say. Of course, we can't be sure, and Ukraine's military has proven very skilled at deception operations.
Yeah.
Last year, Ukraine signaled very loudly, for example, they were going to attack in the south, in Kherson, and Russia moved a lot of its best troops to the south. Once Russia had moved its troops to the south, Ukraine attacked in the east and liberated Kharkiv. When Russia went back there to defend against that offensive, then they attacked in the south. So they have a record of being quite ingenious in that respect. So we don't know where it's going to come exactly, and it's pure speculation. I believe it will be in the south. We'll see. But the fact that it's coming, I think, is beyond question, and it has to come because Ukraine has to show. First of all, the Ukrainian people, but they have to show their international partners as well that they can make gains, that they can advance in order to in order to avoid the sort of pressure that will mount to settle this war. There is a sense like if Ukraine is not able to achieve a victory, then there has to be negotiations. We have to end this. Nobody is enjoying what's happening. I think, frankly, the Russians aren't enjoying it because they're having a terrible time militarily, and they're internationally isolated. They don't feel very good about it. But the die is cast for them. They're stuck there. Ukrainians, of course, more than anyone want this to end because of the horror that's been imposed on the country, this terrible trauma and the huge losses. And the international community is also tired, and they want to end this. So it's very important for Ukraine to show that they can win, and that they have to do that soon. It has to be within the next few months.
We're going to take a final break and be back in 2 minutes with some concluding comments with Peter Dickinson, Kiev, Ukraine. What's going on? Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Our guest tonight is Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council. He's the Ukraine Alert editor there. He's a British citizen living in and has been living in Kiev, Ukraine. We've had a really interesting conversation where he's brought up to date on where the war in Ukraine is right now. We've talked about genocide. We've talked about terrorism. We've talked about a lot of different issues. I wonder, Peter, if you could elevate for a second. I read an article you wrote in 2017, so long before the war, where you were, effectively warning people about what was happening. And then recently you wrote an article about Kazakhstan questioning its association with the USSR, with Russia, and that this was effectively the end of the USSR. Why has this been such a catastrophic blunder for Putin? And really, is this the end of Russian imperialism?
Well, I don't think it's the end of Russian imperialism, but it seems to be a dark chapter for Russian imperialism. It could mark a new chapter of retreat, in fact. The Russian Empire is essentially the last of the great European empires. I think the great trick that Russia has played is disguising its imperial identity, whereas Britain and France and other countries which had imperial possessions dotted around the world map. With Russia, because it was a continuous landmass, they were able to somehow obscure this imperial sort of ID and convince people that it was just a country. Now, I think that's broken down a lot over the last year, especially. There's been an awakening, I think, internationally, and an incredible increasing awareness that Russia is an empire, and also within these countries that are formerly close to Russia, that are that were part of the Russian Empire in the Tsarist times and were part of the Soviet Empire, like, as you mentioned, Kazakhstan, are now saying, you know what, we don't want to be so close to this country because it's dangerous, because we see their attitude, we see what they're doing in Ukraine, we don't want to be next. So we're going to take precautions in advance, we're going to distance ourselves. What we're seeing in Kazakhstan, for example, is they are looking to, they're not saying, we're not going to deal with Russia because geography is destiny. They live next to Russia. They have a huge border with Russia. They're always going to have some form of relationship with Russia. But what they are saying is, you know what, we're going to explore our relations and our historic ties with Turkey and the Turkic world. We're going to build our closer relationship with China. We're going to turn down to the European Union in the West. We're going to engage with America. We're going to go for a much more diverse foreign policy, and we're definitely not anymore going to keep all our eggs in one Russian basket, because it's a dangerous game to play, because they see how Russia is behaving. And we're seeing this elsewhere as well. In the South Caucasus, in Armenia, which is a country which has long been very, very close to Russia by necessity, essentially, is also saying, you know what, we're going to look elsewhere. We're going to look to France. We're going to look to America. We're going to try and build bridges with the Iranians, because we see that Russia is a dangerous country to be too close to, and also because it's not as powerful as it was. Russia has lost the prestige because its military, which was always seen as essentially the face of Russia, the source of Russia's power, has been exposed as far, far weaker than anyone could have possibly imagined.
Peter Dickinson, thank you so much for joining us and giving us an update. If and when this spring offensive begins, I hope you can connect up with us again and tell us about what's going on. I think that we've got to keep talking in the Western media, in Western countries, to make sure that we don't forget what's going on as we get completely focused on our own spring and political issues in Washington and New York and Ottawa, et cetera. We got to keep talking to people like you to make sure that we keep well aware of what's going on and support you, because I do think that what's going on in Ukraine is genocide, and I think it is the end of Russian imperialism, if not, as you say, the end, but certainly a diminution dramatically of Russian imperialism. And I think that that's good for democracy and peace in the world. And so I really appreciate you on your articles that I keep reading, and you coming on and chatting with us today. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Peter, really appreciate it.